Welcome to Project Canine's Dog Talks webinar, Introduction to Crisis Response for Animal-Assisted Therapy Teams. This webinar originated in the wake of the Oso, Washington landslide to help Project Canine teams understand crisis response and make responsible decisions about their role in that disaster. We're all aware that critical incidents happen across our country and all over the world on a daily basis. This webinar is designed to help anyone interested in responding to crises with their dog make sound decisions about whether, when, and how to do that. If you're a Project Canine team, thanks for continuing your training. If you're not a Project Canine team, welcome and thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about myself. My name is Monica Payson, and I've been president of Project Canine since 2011. I've been an animal-assisted therapy handler for 16 years with 4 different partners. This is one of my current partners, Silas. I was nationally certified with National Animal-Assisted Crisis Response with my partner, Ramona. I've been an active member of the Snohomish County Critical Incident Stress Management Team for 8 years. As a CISM responder, I've received basic and advanced CISM training through the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, NIMS compliance training, and ongoing psychological crisis training through my team. I carry my own private insurance for my team responses. As part of my CISM team, I've responded to a wide range of first responder and civilian critical incidents. It's an honor and a privilege to be a part of this work, but each call means something bad has happened, and each response takes something out of you as a responder. By the end of this webinar, you'll understand what that comment means in terms of responding responsibly. A quick word about acronyms. Throughout this webinar, I'll be abbreviating Animal-Assisted Therapy to AAT and Animal-Assisted Crisis Response to AACR. Now, let's take a moment to go over what we'll be covering today. If you progress with a national AACR organization, and I'll give you contacts for those at the end of the webinar, you'll have opportunities to learn about AACR in more depth. This webinar is designed to give you background knowledge about the complexities of crisis response in general and basic tools to assess whether crisis response is right for you and your dog. Along the way, I'll be showing you why training, certifying, and deploying through a recognized AACR organization is essential if you want to pursue crisis response with your dog. Let's start with some basic definitions. We'll talk about critical incidents first, and then come around to psychological crises. In this definition of critical incident, I've highlighted the words resulting in, because it's important to understand that the incident, the response, and people's reactions to both of those are not the same thing. For the moment, we're focusing on the incident, which in turn causes human responses and reactions. There are a few key points to make here. Critical incidents are events outside the normal. They're abnormal. They can be human-caused or natural. They're ongoing and unfolding. The incident itself can last minutes, like an earthquake, to hours, like a shooting or a fire, to years, like a war. The response is always ongoing and may last minutes to years. The response always begins and ends locally. There are 3 types of critical incident, all of which have different impacts. Emergencies result in either physical destruction or injury or loss of human life, or all 3. They may challenge but not exceed the local response capacity. Examples of emergencies are a car accident, a house fire, or a shooting. These things happen fairly frequently in our communities, though they may not directly affect very many people. Mental health services, including AACR, will be provided immediately after and on an ongoing basis afterward. Disasters differ from emergencies in their magnitude of impact. They disrupt social cohesion and community function, they exceed local emergency response capacity, and they require recruitment of additional response capabilities, state and federal. Examples of disasters are the Oso, Washington mudslide and the school massacre at Sandy Hook. Obviously, this type of incident happens much less frequently, maybe once in a lifetime for most people. Mental health services will be provided during the response and recovery and on an ongoing basis afterward. Catastrophes are overwhelming in their impact. With catastrophes, there is the real possibility that social cohesion and community function will be eliminated. Examples of catastrophes are the earthquake in Haiti, Fukushima, Hurricane Katrina, and 9/11. Mental health services will not be provided in the acute phase of a catastrophe because survival is the highest priority. Here's another way to think about critical incidents that illustrates why some events are emergencies, some are disasters, and some are catastrophes. The outcome of the equation is dependent not just on the magnitude of the event, but on the vulnerability of the population and the ability of the community to cope. An event that is a disaster in one community might be a catastrophe in another. Now that we have a basic understanding of what a critical incident is, we can talk about psychological crises. A psychological crisis is the human experience of or reaction to the incident. The result is acute psychological or behavioral distress, or both, with some degree of functional impairment. This can be mild to severe depending on the nature of the event and the individual's pre-existing resiliency. It's important to emphasize that a psychological crisis is a normal reaction to an abnormal event, and most people will return to normal functioning on their own or with limited intervention. Crisis response is aimed at mitigating the impact of the event. In terms of people, that mitigation happens at a number of levels, and the timing of various responses generally follows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs was developed by American psychologist Abraham Maslow as a way of understanding how the human brain prioritizes its needs. The basic idea is that higher level, or psychological needs, can come into focus only once lower level, or physical needs, are met. So, for example, you can't begin to address a person's psychological trauma if they're wounded or hungry. You'll need to get them medical attention or food first. The response to a critical incident generally follows Maslow in the sense that a lot of the initial mobilization will focus on meeting basic needs: rescue, stabilization of the site, caring for the wounded, and providing food, water, and shelter. First responders respond at this most basic level, and it's essential that they be allowed to do that without interference. Emotional crisis responders, including AACR, respond higher up Maslow's hierarchy, and we must not get in the way of those responding. This sounds pretty simple, but the bottom line is that critical incidents are by their nature chaotic. Clearly, a lot of things have to happen after any critical incident to make sure that people's needs are met and the community can return to normal functioning. It takes a lot of people to make a crisis response happen. This is a list just off the top of my head of agencies and organizations that responded to the Oso Washington mudslide, and I'm sure this is far short of the actual list. So here's where it gets tricky. All of those individuals and organizations that I listed on the previous slide have to work together to make recovery happen. That encompasses mental health providers, including AACR, as well as first responders and all the agencies and organizations responsible for rebuilding. As responders, we need to make sure that we're part of a coordinated effort so that we're not doing more harm to the people we're trying to help. How does that happen? The National Incident Management System, NIMS, is the administrative system for the handling of any emergency, including multi-jurisdictional and multi-agency responses of local, state, and federal resources to a large-scale incident such as a disaster. All federal agencies and all local, tribal, state, and private organizations receiving federal funds are required to operate according to NIMS. All responders to a domestic incident must be NIMS compliant, meaning they've received the appropriate NIMS training for their level of response. This includes AACR teams. NIMS has 6 components, but the Incident Command System, the ICS, is the part that most directly affects incident response. The ICS has 3 attributes that assist in effective incident response. It helps crisis intervention organizations work as teams and keep their personnel safe. It establishes a clear chain of command within the response that every responder fits into. And it establishes unity of command, which describes the relationship between an individual and his or her supervisor. Without unity of command in a large-scale incident, there would be enormous confusion at the scene. This is why it's critical for AACR responders to train and respond with a recognized AACR organization. And this is why IS 100 is a minimum national standard of HOPE AACR, National AACR, and national organizations active in disaster. Now that we have a basic understanding of critical incidents and the structure that keeps the response organized, let's get more specific and talk about psychological crisis response. Psychological crisis response is the mental health equivalent of physical first aid and is the response rubric that AACR falls under. The goals of psychological crisis response are: the stabilization of psychological functioning by meeting basic physical needs. Remember Maslow's hierarchy? Then addressing the most basic psychological needs. Never underestimate the power of a sandwich and a cup of coffee. Mitigation of psychological dysfunction or distress and reduction of functional impairment. Return to adaptive or normal psychological functioning. And facilitation of access to the next level of care if necessary. The focus here is always on the present crisis reaction, not past or potential future issues. This is not therapy, though that might happen later if a person is having trouble returning to normal functioning after a reasonable period of time. Early interventions need to be adaptive and flexible. They should match people's needs in the moment. Remember that sandwich and cup of coffee. They should be culturally sensitive. This is particularly important with dogs. They should be available but not enforced. They should not interfere with the ongoing response effort. Always remember that the people addressing the operational and logistical aspects of a critical incident need to stay at a cognitive level in order to function in their jobs. Now that you understand the goals of psychological crisis response, let's do a quick overview of modalities. You'll probably be required to train in some of these modalities if you pursue AACR, most likely CISM, Psychological First Aid, or SAFER R. And you'll probably encounter people providing these services if you respond to an incident. Critical Incident Stress Management, also called CISM or CISM, is a comprehensive, integrated, multi-component approach to crisis intervention and disaster mental health services. Interventions range from large group to small group to one-on-one sessions. CISM is an ongoing approach applying the appropriate intervention before, during, and after an incident. It's peer-based, though teams always include mental health professionals. This approach was developed for the military and first responders, but it's now also used in civilian contexts as well. Field traumatology is the approach developed by the Green Cross, and I don't have a good understanding of their training or deployment requirements. You can find out more at the Green Cross website. Pastoral crisis intervention is provided by chaplains. It's an integration of principles and practices of psychological crisis response with faith-based leadership. Chaplains provide spiritual and religious support, but also usually just offer human support as well. Again, the cup of coffee and a sandwich. The point is that when people are experiencing a crisis, you provide them with what they need most in that moment. Psychological first aid is a support and compassionate presence designed to reduce acute psychological distress and/or facilitate continued support. This is a one-on-one approach including education about normal stress reactions, skills in active listening, importance of maintaining physical health, and understanding of when to seek help from professional caregivers. SAFER R is a protocol for conducting individual crisis response interventions that can be integrated into any of the above modalities. The acronym stands for Stabilize the Situation, Maslow again, Acknowledge the Crisis, Facilitate Understanding, Encourage Adaptive Coping, Restore Adaptive Independent Functioning, or Refer to a higher level of care. Refer is the second R that may or may not be needed. Notice there are some overlaps there with psychological first aid. And finally, AACR. The goal of AACR is to provide comfort and encouragement through animal-assisted support to individuals affected by critical incidents. AACR teams may fit into CISM or Green Cross interventions, but they should have appropriate training to do that. It's important to emphasize again that none of these approaches is therapy, and they are all based in the idea that most people will return to normal functioning with little or no intervention. The idea is always to supply only what is needed in the moment. Now that you have an understanding of critical incidents, how responses are organized, and the types of psychological responses provided, let's talk about how AACR differs from AAT. This portion of the webinar will help you decide whether AACR is right for you and your dog. So what are some of the key differences? Schedule. AACR is on-call and irregular. You need to be able to deploy when there's an incident and for a portion or the duration of the response. If your work or family obligations make irregular scheduling difficult, AACR is probably not right for you. Location. You'll probably have to travel some distance for a call-out. How often do disasters happen in your backyard? By car, by bus, or even by plane? You may be bussed between the scene and your accommodations. You may have to do a lot of walking in the course of your deployment. Your base may be in a building, but it might also be a tent or even outdoors. The conditions might be harsh in terms of terrain or weather. Stress levels are usually very high. You'll be in unpredictable surroundings with people in distress. There might be a lot of noise and chaos. Cost. If you go through an AACR organization for certification, and I recommend that you do, you'll have to pay annual dues in addition to your normal AAT registration or certification fees. You'll also have to pay for your travel, specialty gear for yourself and your dog, and your ongoing training. And finally, longevity. Your AACR career is going to be shorter than your AAT career. This is not an activity that most dogs will do into old age. Now let's talk about whether you and your dog are right for AACR. Over the course of the next couple of slides, you might discover that you're right for AACR, but your dog is not. Or you might discover that your dog is right for AACR, but you are not. Those are good things to learn before you invest in training, or worse, deploy. And there are plenty of other things you can do with your dog that are fulfilling and challenging to you both. Let's discuss handler characteristics first. Are you calm under high-stress circumstances? Can you adapt to chaos? Are you empathetic to but not disturbed by intense emotions in others? This is a picture of me and my partner Ramona at a mock disaster relief center at an AACR training. The young woman behind me was role-playing a catatonic disaster survivor. We also encountered people who were weeping and people who were shouting. Notice that I have my backpack full of gear, and that stayed with me through every aspect of the training as it would in an actual deployment. Right here, we're talking about issues of both emotional and physical resilience. This part of the training lasted only about 20 minutes, but it was loud, crowded, and chaotic. Some of us walked out of that drill ready to go back in. One woman in my training cohort came out and said, "I don't ever want to be in a situation like that again." That's a really important realization. Much better to make it in training than during a real deployment. Just as a side note, does anyone notice anything significant about Ramona in this picture? If you've gone through Project Canine training, you've probably zeroed in on her lip lick, a clear sign of canine stress. An accumulation of these types of stress signals would be something you'd want to watch for in training, and definitely on a deployment. Can you adapt to unusual or challenging circumstances? This is me and my friend Pam trying to negotiate a restaurant buffet with our big dogs. On a deployment, you might have limited options for what and where you eat, and your dog will be with you the whole time. I think I had 3 garbanzo beans and a hard-boiled egg for dinner that night, but I got through the buffet. Let's run through a few more important handler characteristics before turning to canine characteristics. Can you tolerate exposure to distressing situations, either witnessing them yourself or hearing about them from others who have directly experienced them? Can you work within a command or team structure? Remember, you'll need to fit within the ICS structure, and if you deploy with an AACR organization, you'll be working within a team. And finally, can you say no if you need to? Are you able to recognize in yourself when you need to turn down a call out? This might be because the situation is just not right for your dog. I'll give you an example of this later. Or it might be because you don't have the personal resiliency at the moment to be emotionally present for those in need. When my dad died a couple of years ago, I found myself not wanting to attend my CISM team meetings and trainings. I realized that I was experiencing emotional burnout and needed to take some time to take care of myself before I could go back to taking care of others. What characteristics do AACR dogs need? The first 3 listed here seem pretty obvious, and they're just the same as the human characteristics. Your dog, like you, needs to be tolerant of high levels of stress in other people, and she needs to be able to shake off that stress when she leaves the scene. That's resiliency. Let's talk about adaptability for a minute. Can your dog tolerate noise? Equipment and human noise at a response site can be very high. Some dogs can learn to tolerate things like fire trucks with exposure and positive reinforcement. If you think you can teach your dog to tolerate noise, things like sirens, loud engine noise, loudspeakers, the time to do that is before you train and deploy. Work on that before you have to put it to the test. Some dogs just don't tolerate noise. This is Ramona interacting with a firefighter in full gear. Firefighters in full gear look and sound like Darth Vader. I'm not kidding. Dogs need to be able to take in stride people in all kinds of uniforms and gear. One dog in our training just couldn't tolerate the firefighter gear. It was too foreign, and he began growling. That's a disappointment for his handler, but it's so much better to know that before you go on deployment. One thing we teach hard at Project Canine is to advocate for your dog. That means you need to know your dog and not subject him to intolerable levels of stress. And what's intolerable is going to be very different for different dogs. AACR is moving toward a more regional model, but teams sometimes need to come in from around the country to fill the need. You might need to fly. Can your dog adapt to that? A few final notes about adaptability. If you pursue crisis response, your dog will need to be able to eat, sleep, and eliminate in new and chaotic circumstances. You may never have thought about this before, but take a moment. If your dog only ever poops under a bush with lots of leaves underneath, he's going to have a really hard time on a deployment to New York City. And finally, consider the physical adaptability of your dog in terms of breed and age. That actually came up for me in 2011 when teams were called up to attend 9/11 anniversary activities. I had the opportunity to apply to deploy in New York. I really wanted to go, but I had to be honest with myself that walking around New York in September was not a safe situation for a bull mastiff. That was not a situation my dog could adapt to, and I had to say no. But what about highly sociable and handler-oriented? Do those seem antithetical? What I mean is that your dog has to be motivated to interact with others, to provide comfort, but also be willing and able to give you her full attention when you ask for it. In the middle of that chaotic scene when someone is screaming or the person I'm interacting with becomes unstable, I need to know that my dog can tune out the distractions and focus on me. When my dog is focused on me, she is able to think and follow instructions, and she feels safe. If you've come through these last few slides and realized that your dog is not right for crisis response, but you are, you can still become involved. You can train to become an AACR team leader and deploy without your dog, or you can join a community emergency response team in your area. If, on the other hand, you've come this far and think both you and your dog are right for AACR, you might be asking yourself, why go through all the trouble of training and certifying with an AACR organization? You can certainly go out there and find an organization that just sends dogs and handlers to events. You can get in your car and show up to events by yourself. We see both of these types of volunteers on the media every time there's a disaster. Let me give you a cautionary word about the media. The guy with the bulldog in the back of his car and the group of beautiful Goldens descending on the scene make outstanding TV. The press eats this stuff up, and so does the public. But I hope you've learned enough about the nature of crisis response and the ICS to know now why that's not a good idea. It potentially adds to the chaos. It's potentially dangerous to those in need of help. It's distracting to the responders, and it's potentially dangerous to the handlers and the dogs. I'm a big proponent of training. Training is really just another way of saying being prepared, and being prepared helps keep everyone safe. And let's not underestimate the potential for harm to you and your dog at a critical incident scene. You face physical challenges, but also exposure to psychological trauma. Training and affiliation with an AACR organization helps mitigate risk to you and your dog while enhancing the potential to help those in need. AACR-specific training does several things that general AAT training cannot do. It pre-screens dogs and handlers for high-stress visiting. You might discover you don't want to do this. Remember the handler I told you about earlier who discovered she didn't like crisis scenes? You might discover your dog doesn't want to do this. Remember the dog who growled at the firefighter? AACR-specific training also provides handlers with basic training in emotional crisis response, as well as access to additional training. And it provides handlers with crisis-specific dog training and handling skills. There's real value in certification, too. Do you remember at the beginning of this webinar I mentioned that I carry my own insurance to respond with my CISM team? Project Canine's AAT insurance does not cover teams to make crisis response visits. We define a crisis response as any visit in response to an unusual occurrence at a site where you don't typically visit. For those handlers with other AAT organizations, your insurance also might not cover you for crisis response visits. But if you certify with an AACR organization, you will be insured for your crisis response visits. When you're certified with an AACR organization, you'll deploy at the request of the proper authorities and within the ICS structure. You'll visit with an AACR team leader so that you fall within the chain of command and have unity of command. Because you're deploying within a team structure, you'll know who to go to for support or to report a concern. And someone with canine knowledge will be watching out for you and your dog. You will also be visiting within tested protocols for keeping both dogs and handlers safe. This includes limiting the number and duration of visits. This is really important because it's really easy to feel that you need to keep slogging through when you're on scene. Deploying through an AACR organization also means that you have access to support and debriefing through your team and others within the organization. I can't stress the importance of this enough. The potential for secondary or even primary traumatization in crisis response work is high. AACR handlers need access to peers they can go to for support. This is in fact consistent with well-researched CISM practices. In this photo, my AACR team is debriefing after a long day of training. I had had a particularly tough training experience taking Ramona on an escalator for the first time, and being able to connect with my team afterward was really important to my resiliency. Despite a difficult experience, I ended that day feeling positive and ready to continue with training. Finally, I just want to stress the importance of credible AACR organizations to the larger field of disaster assistance. HOPE and NAACR have published national standards for AACR. This is an important step in professionalizing and legitimizing AACR, and we should support efforts to do this type of outreach within the guidelines described by disaster mental health experts and as called for by NIMS. HOPE AACR is also a member of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, NVOAD, an organization that works to define the role of volunteers in disaster response. Again, this is about following crisis response guidelines that call for responding organizations to cooperate, communicate, coordinate, and collaborate to help victims. We should support that by aligning ourselves with organizations that follow these guidelines. In the wake of a number of critical incidents in 2014, I was contacted about sending Project Canine teams to assist victims. While it's always hard to say no to this kind of request, I hope it's clear from what we've talked about today why I referred those calls on to HOPE AACR and National AACR. Project Canine certification and insurance don't cover crisis response. Our teams don't have psychological crisis intervention training. They're not trained in the incident command structure. And we don't have the team structure in place for this type of response. If you're registered with another AAT organization, please check with your contact person about whether or not you're covered to respond to critical incidents. Even if you are cleared to respond without further training and certification, I hope this presentation has made the case for why it's important not to do that. If you're interested in pursuing AACR, I urge you to contact one of the two national AACR training and certification organizations, HOPE Animal Assisted Crisis Response or National Animal Assisted Crisis Response. I've listed their web addresses here, and both organizations are active on Facebook. You can find additional information about crisis response and crisis response training through these organizations. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you learned enough about critical incidents and crisis response to decide if AACR is something you'd like to pursue with your dog. At the very least, you'll have a little background for understanding what's happening the next time a critical incident impacts one of our communities. Project Canine is a Seattle-based nonprofit therapy dog training and certification organization. We have teams active throughout Washington and Oregon, and we have a number of teams active in AACR. You can find us online at www.projectcanine.org. If you have any questions about Project Canine, crisis response, or this presentation, please contact me at monica@projectcanine.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook.